All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to Public Sector Labor Struggles Then and Now. This program is sponsored by Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. It is part of the Union Days program that is being coordinated by the Worker Institute, which is part of ILR's extension work. I'm chatting the website address of ILR so that you can learn more about the Union Days program, especially if you are in Ithaca, because we have a number of in-person events that you may be interested in attending on campus, on or around campus. But we wanted to do a webinar because we know that the issues that we are discussing here have national reach, and we wanted to bring together voices from folks who are in the trenches of these struggles and are observing and studying these struggles from different parts of the country. So the idea for this panel discussion emerged in the first weeks of Trump's second term, when the White House and Elon Musk's Doge minions were just getting warmed up with their agenda of slashing jobs, freezing funding, and dismantling whole agencies. And since then, the crisis has only expanded, and this conversation has seemed more and more urgent. But the reason I and other faculty at ILR wanted to host this discussion is not that this attack on the public sector is unprecedented, but rather that it actually feels quite familiar to observers of labor history. Trump's drive to undermine and strip rights away from the public sector reflects a long history of anti-union, anti-government politics in Washington and beyond. Yet there's also a parallel history of resistance and organizing in response to these assaults on civil servants. The next chapter of that story is, in fact, being written by public sector labor unions and advocates today. So we're here this afternoon to try to put all this in context and to talk about what civil servants have done in the past and what they're doing now to protect their rights, their livelihoods, and the integrity of the services that they provide, which our communities rely on. Our panelists this afternoon come from academia and from the front lines of the labor movement. So hopefully this conversation will yield some ideas on what we can all do to save our services and to restore protections for the workers who make our government run. Eric Blanc is a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University. He's author of the new book, We Are the Union: How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. And he's currently involved in organizing with the Federal Unionist Network, or FUN. Joe McCartin is a professor of American history at Georgetown University and executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. His groundbreaking scholarship, which I'm sure many of you know, focuses on the intersection of labor organization, politics, and public policy, including his canonical history of the air traffic controllers strike under the Reagan administration. Todd Dickey is an assistant professor of public administration and international affairs at Syracuse University, where his research and teaching centers on workplace conflict management, federal sector labor relations, and labor management partnership in the public and nonprofit sectors. And he previously served as advisor to the chairman at the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Aurora Roher is a public school social studies teacher and secretary of the Ithaca Teachers Association, or ITA. She's also co-chair of the ITA Contract Action Team, which is currently bargaining a contract. MT Snyder is a graduate of ILR's master's program and is now a field examiner with the National Labor Relations Board in San Francisco. She's joining us today in her personal capacity as a rank and file member of the National Labor Relations Board Union and an organizer with the Federal Unionist Network. So as we get started, I'd just like to have each of you talk a little bit about how you have become involved in public sector labor issues, whether you study them or are actually part of a public workforce, and more importantly, talk about how you and your community have been responding to the political turmoil and threats to civil servants coming out of Washington in recent weeks. So, MT, we can start with you.
Sure. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me. I would say that probably being a TA for your labor history class was one of my first experiences with learning about the public sector. labor movement and struggles. And when I joined the National Labor Relations Board, I joined our union. We have incredibly high membership rate, as you might expect, and so I think like that was my experience. With being in the public sector labor movement and continues through today. And I was involved in organizing with my union, organizing, different, showing up to different events and also different petitions and bargaining over local terms and conditions. And then in late December of last year, or like actually maybe earlier, I found out about the Federal Unionist Network, and I got involved with them and have since been organizing with the Federal Unionist Network, which is a group of federal union members who are across agencies and workplaces, and unions, of course, to coordinate and collaborate and share strategies for making our union stronger and for fighting back against, right now, the attacks on our jobs and on the services that we provide. So that's what I've been up to.
Hmm. Uh, Joe, sort of toggling back and forth between folks who are in the trenches and folks wearing their academic hats. So,
Sure. Thank you for having me, Michelle. It's wonderful to be on a panel with these folks. So I am the son and grandson of public sector workers. I have been a union member. The first union that I paid dues to was a AFSCME local, Council 82. I grew up in upstate New York. I was a lifeguard in state parks, and Council 82 represents correction officers. I don't know how I ended up in it, but I was in that union briefly. I went to graduate school at SUNY Binghamton and was part of the group of graduate students who formed what became the Graduate Student Employees Union at Binghamton. Now it's CWA Local 1104. So I've been involved in public sector stuff because I grew up in it and have been a member of it. But as I became a labor historian, I was also drawn into the study of public sector unions. And that led me to write a book called Collision Course about what I think was the most important strike of the late 20th century, the PATCO strike, the air traffic controllers strike that Ronald Reagan broke, and that I think had a devastating impact, and I think has a lot of pertinence to what's going on today. I've been at Georgetown since 1999 and gotten to work a lot with union folks here. One of the most important connections that I think that I've made in that work is to meet some of the folks who would go on to found the Federal Unionist Network. And I met some of them in 2018 and 19 during the shutdown then. So to see the Federal Unionist Network emerge at this moment, it's been one of the most promising things I've seen or studied in labor history. So it's a real pleasure to be here.
lots of upstate New York representation.
Yeah.
To see it. Aurora.
Hi, I'm Aurora Roger, and I'm a social studies teacher at the Lehman Alternative Community School in Ithaca, New York. And as Michelle said, I'm the secretary of the Ithaca Teachers Association. I'm really excited to be here and honored to be on this panel with so many illustrious people. And yeah, so the Ithaca Teachers Association, we're a pretty small local. We're a little under 600 members. And we're currently bargaining a contract. We're the first teacher union in New York State to be using open bargaining. So I'm really excited to talk more about that and how I think that has transformed our union. I'm also part of two kind of broader organizations that I'll mention. So I helped to facilitate a bi-weekly group called the Community Union Organizers that was founded by Ellen David Friedman, who's on this call, which is a local group that gets together every other week, and we just basically do labor notes stuff. We talk about what's going on in our workplace and help each other kind of brainstorm how to organize around those issues. And that's been like an amazing space that has birthed multiple unions, including the Gimme Union, which is the first baristas union in the country. Before Starbucks, there was Gimme in Ithaca, including Green Star is one of it's our local food co-op, and they just finally unionized, but we were part of their first and this new successful struggle. So lots of great work happening there. And then I'm also happy to be part of UCOR, which is a network of teacher unions across the country. I'll quote, National Network of Pre-K-12 Educator caucuses who share strategies, workshop challenges, and support each other as we transform our unions. So in my union, we didn't do a caucus, but we had a kind of caucus current situation where we sort of, a group of comrades, we kind of rank and filed our union and took it over and have done really cool stuff inspired by places like Chicago and LA. And so we're really happy to be like in a network where we can be learning from these other struggles.
Great. And lastly, Todd, and then Eric.
Hey everyone, it's so great to be here at Union Days as a former ILR PhD student. Spent many trying to remember the name of that auditorium in Ives Hall, many a Union Days in person, but it's really great that we're able to do this on the web because, as Michelle said, we would be overflow room if we were on campus. So it's really an honor to be here. And yeah, I'm also really honored to be on this panel with everyone and get to share our stories and different perspectives. When it comes to the federal sector, I have a really, I guess it wasn't a planned path, but my first full-time job after graduating with my bachelor's was a permanent career civil service position. To this day, family members will still say, why did you give that up to go to graduate school? But it was, I really am just so grateful I had that experience because I worked at the Federal Trade Commission, which is a smaller consumer protection, competition protection, as they would say, agency protecting America's consumers. And it was just such an amazingly inspiring job to be helping people access their free annual credit report and access, all of these consumer protection needs right out of college. And the public service element was just, I couldn't ask for anything better. And I was one of those people that I had no idea what open shop meant or no idea how the federal sector labor relations program worked, and joined the union as I thought you did if it said on your orientation packet that I'm in a bargaining unit position. I later found out what open shop meant when I talked to all of my colleagues in their 20s, and none of them were in the union, and I was the only one. And then I started to learn and get involved, and soon was elected to a local officer position in the AFG local, representing Federal Trade Commission employees, and then joined our negotiating team for our contract renewal, and then the rest is history. Decided to go get my master's degree at Syracuse and then PhD at ILR. And all along, even though I've expanded and broadened a little bit, federal sector has always been a focus of mine just because of my background and the importance of it now more than ever. And I was honored the last couple of years to serve as an advisor, as Michelle was saying, to first Chairman DeBester at the FLRA, Federal Labor Relations Authority, and then Chairman Grunman. And it was just quite an honor to see all of the energy and the passion and the commitment to the federal sector of folks kind of from that inside perspective, and can talk more about that. But one of the things that time has really taught me is this notion of really being just cataloging everything going on right now and making sure that we're just taking stock of the situation, because the former Chairman Grumman would always show a PowerPoint slide that was so powerful of the agency's budget in the year 2004 in real dollars was in the exact, I think I actually wrote it down. It was 29.6 million. And then their fiscal year 2024 proposed budget was 29.4 million. So in actual dollars, it was less over a 20-year period, which meant about 50% cut in the amount of full-time employees there. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been thinking a lot about looking from the outside, the federal sector right now, and really thinking about how do we not lose sight of the importance of the work and not let some of the cuts be the new normal. So I'm excited to have this conversation and really engage. And yeah, I think we can come out more inspired with paths forward. So thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah. Hey everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'll keep it brief. I've been a high school teacher, public school high school teacher. Most of my organizing was in K-12. I wrote a book around the 2018 teacher strikes. But more recently, since the pandemic, I've been really involved in trying to figure out how to scale up bottom-up worker organizing. So I've helped found the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which supports workers self-organize. And I think it was partly in that capacity, and partly because I wrote a book around bottom-up organizing that I got asked by some of the leaders of the fund early on this year to help support. So I've been ever since then mostly just organizing and supporting the organizing that the fund is doing. And so I've been, as I was mentioning to Michelle earlier, I've been too busy to be depressed by the state of the world, which is it's actually sort of a nice fringe benefit of spending all day organizing, turns out. So looking forward to the discussion.
The title of this panel could have been Too Busy to Be Depressed, but hopefully we'll leave on a high note. For just kick off the conversation, I think a lot of the people attending in the audience have probably been following the news about the cutbacks and the various disruptions and political chaos that has been rocking the federal workforce under Trump. But I just wanted to pitch a question to MT and Aurora specifically to talk about what you have been observing in your workplaces as both union members and organizers and just workers who are in the trenches right now in the public sector. Can you talk about how you've been feeling the impact of some of these executive orders or just the general sort of sense of political uncertainty? So I don't know if you can start. Sure.
Sure. So yeah, I think I'm experiencing this every day, as with all, I think, federal agencies, we've been required to return to office, which is basically revoking our telework rights that we negotiate in our collective bargaining agreements, rescinding those, and that's a pay cut. Now I have to commute every day to the office, and I had the right to telework, and I had that right when I had this job, when I started my job. And then, my other coworkers are handling childcare needs, are handling long commutes. And so I think that's like very real. One very real way we're feeling the executive orders. I think there's also a lot of uncertainty, right? Are our jobs going to exist next year? Are we going to be laid off next month or sooner? I think that this creates, it's personally very difficult, economically, right? But then also, me, my coworkers, federal workers, we take our jobs because we believe in the mission. We want to serve the American public. We want to provide the services that we do. I'm speaking in a personal capacity here, of course, but like one of the things that I do is I run union elections, or I investigate unfair labor practice charges. I've never seen a billionaire do that. So if we're not doing that, who's going to run the elections? So I think that's one of the like bigger concerns with this threat to our democracy is that we provide public services that the public relies on, and those are under attack right now.
Yeah. So I think it's like, I don't want to say we're lucky, but the federal government does not do a lot of funding of public education already. So like we're not funded mainly by the federal government. So about 4% of funding in New York State is federal for our schools, and the rest is state and local. And in Ithaca, it's mostly local taxes. So in terms of funding, like cutting the Department of Education, obviously terrifying in like a vague sense, but in like a material sense, it's not clear what exactly that would mean. the IDEA, which is the law that like supports students with special needs, or special ed students, is like an unfunded mandate from the federal government. So I don't see Ithaca or New York State saying like we're not going to serve special ed students anymore if, say, the Department of Education was cut. So I think that because the Department of Education already is like so lacking in what they do, it's like that is like a little bit of a buffer. In terms of like other scary things on the ground that we're facing, I'd say the sort of anti-woke DEI situation. Ithaca is a very like social justice oriented district, which I love and is one of the reasons that I really wanted to teach here. And we're currently being investigated by the Trump administration. There was actually a Cornell law professor, William Jacobson, who filed a civil rights complaint against us for having a Students of Color summit that was for students of color. And that was discrimination against white students, according to him. So we're under investigation right now. But I personally am like, how can you investigate us and also cut the Department of Education? It seems like it's got to be one or the other. So that's like one of those, I don't know. If you don't have any people to investigate, then maybe we're okay. And then I'd say the other really scary thing with executive orders are around our immigrant families and ICE. So that's one place where I'm just really grateful to be part of UCOR. So the like immediately follow, I don't even remember which executive order, but immediately following one of the scary ICE things, there was like an ICE truck in Ithaca and people were very scared. They didn't come into our schools. But that night there was a UCOR, UCOR is our national network, a UCOR call, and I heard from teachers in DC who are like, yeah, there have been ICE trucks up and down our streets nonstop. They're trying to intimidate us. And teachers in Miami who are saying that like they haven't seen their students in a week because caregivers are keeping them home because they don't think it's safe for them to go to school. So all sorts of really terrible horror stories that we're not experiencing yet, but also heard from teachers in Seattle and in LA who are talking about how they're already fighting back and sort of the policies that they're fighting for to protect their students from ICE. And one of the great things about being in a social justice district is when there's things like that, like we just, I DM'd them and like got their policies. And then like the next day, our union president met with our school board president and was like, can we do something like this? And we did. So there are like ways that we can fight back like that, and like being part of a national network and learning from each other feels really powerful. But in terms of like the federal attacks on education, it's more like fear, uncertainty, doubt than it is like concrete material threats right now in Ithaca.
Eric, I mean, you are in the public sector, and you're also an organizer for other public sector workers. Do you have any sort of insights from what it's like to be teaching at a public university at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I've been talking about it is that the tip of the spear is what they first did to the federal workers. They would, like Musk went really hard immediately against federal workers. And soon after that, we saw what they did with Columbia, right? And what I've been telling folks and what our union's been telling folks is, the exact, it's the same playbook that they used against federal workers and they use against Columbia. Now they're using it across the board in higher ed, where they're, using the threats of revoking funding essentially to force universities to accept the sort of reactionary agenda that Trump wants to impose, whether it's cracking down on, Palestine activists or DEI or just sort of general reaction. So it's hard to, I think, exaggerate the stakes of fight back right now, not just because of sort of the obvious reasons, but because so much, I think, of what the Trump administration is doing is gauging how much pushback there is, again, when they do what they do. It's not, I don't think it's the case that they just sort of like ignore public opinion. They go really far against it, but the more pushback there is, the more it makes them question how far and fast they can go. And so the fact that Columbia capitulated without a fight was just a hugely detrimental blow to all of higher ed and to all public sector unionism. But in contrast, the fact that there's been a real fight back in the federal unionist network, so much so that now I don't know if people saw Trump sort of behind the scenes leak to Politico that Musk is going to be out. So this is what we've been hoping for, is that Musk would be forced out because he's so unpopular. Well, it turns out like that power analysis seems to be bearing fruit, where there's so much backlash against the cuts that they're doing that we're able to force out the wink link, and remains to be seen. But I think that that's the same thing that we're going to have to see now in our higher ed, is that if we can get enough backlash against the most egregious parts of the Trump agenda, like for instance, what they did to our sister at Tufts, where they just grabbed somebody off of the street for no reason other than expressing opinion. That goes, I think, against so many of the norms of not just sort of leftists or unionists, but just frankly, ordinary people, including as some people who might have voted for Trump. If we can have enough backlash against these things and organize that in a concerted way, I do think that there's a real possibility of winning and pushing back and forcing the admin of our universities to not capitulate. And but it is ultimately a question of organizing. To me, this is like the crucial thing, is there's so much sentiment. We saw this on last weekend, April 5th. There's, millions of people want to fight back, but it's at this point mostly unorganized. And so just like one day of action is not going to be enough. You need to have people step up to become organizers, by which I mean like go out and talk to their coworkers, talk to their community members, to get them involved. And we need to figure out mechanisms to be training up large numbers of new leaders. And I think that is still, frankly, a weak spot, that we don't really, the sentiment is actually higher than our existing infrastructure to sort of channel that. So to me, we have to like figure out how to bridge that gap as soon as possible if we're going to defeat Trump and Musk.
Mm-hmm. To sort of bring this back a little bit, or to zoom out a little bit, this is a question that I originally wrote with Joe in mind, given his historical research, but of course anyone with kind of a long view on public sector labor struggles is free to chime in. Can we just put what is unfolding in the federal government today in historical context, and how would you compare, if you can compare, the public sector labor struggles that you see happening currently to past labor struggles that we saw in the 70s, 80s, perhaps, or even in more recent memory? How unprecedented is this, or do we see it as sort of, another chapter and very long, sort of drawn out assault against public sector workers? So any ideas, Joe?
Sure. It's such a big question, and zooming back to take a big view of it, I guess what I would say is that this is both unprecedented, but a long time coming, and not a full surprise, and the logical outgrowth of a lot of things that have been happening for a long time. And by that, I mean the attack on the federal sector primarily, but it's not going to stay there. I think one thing that history suggests is that the public sector, although it's divided federal, state, local, is all connected. And the history of how the public sector got unionized had a lot to do with the federal government's role. At the time when John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 10988 in 1962, still there was only one state that had enacted a public sector bargaining law, Wisconsin. There were only a few municipalities that were engaged in collective bargaining, New York and Philadelphia being the main ones. The impact of the Kennedy order was to help open a door. And over the course of the 60s and 70s, there was an efflorescence of organizing, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level, even more so. Of course, at the federal level, workers never really won true collective bargaining. They couldn't bargain over their pay. They couldn't bargain over their benefits. That remains true down to the present day. Also in the federal sector from day one, it was an open shop. That is, there was no compulsion to pay union dues or agency fees to the union. And what that led to, that limited kind of bargaining and in a place that encouraged free riders, quite frankly, was the emergence on the federal level of, organizations that had trouble building their organizational muscle. And for a long time, they failed to do that. There were some exceptions to that. Postal workers. In 1970, they staged a huge, massive strike. A couple 100,000 participated in it. It was a wildcat strike, but it basically liberated them from this federal system. It got the USPS created, under which they had much more robust bargaining. The other group that challenged the system, of course, was the air traffic controllers. It ended up very badly for them. Reagan broke their strike in 1981, and doing it in the kind of way that he did it delivered a real blow, not just to federal sector labor relations. He fired and replaced over 11,000 people who basically went into their strike believing that they were irreplaceable. That they thought that would win them the strike. He fired them. He exploded the idea that they couldn't be replaced. That had a huge psychological impact on the federal sector, but it bled out from there. It, I think, affected public sector labor relations and also private sector labor relations. Um, and really, from the 1970s forward, when I say this has been a long time coming, there has been a brewing attack on the public sector union movement, which at the time of the PATCO strike, public sector workers were about a third of the movement. Now, most recently, they've been almost half. And so to take on the public sector has always been a high priority for those who want to weaken unionism. They've been working at it a long time, as many people on this call know very well. The Supreme Court enlisted for that fight. And in recent years, they've been quite active with decisions like the Janus decision to try to put all public sector workers on that, open shop basis that the federal workers have been on. And so the federal government's role in things has kind of been important as a bellwether and helping to shape things. And that's what makes, I think, the current fight so deeply important, the fight that MT and others are involved in, because that fight's going to bleed down to how it is in the Ithaca schools, how it is at Rutgers and everywhere else. If they can be successful in, basically deunionizing the federal government, stripping union rights from about 1 million workers, that will have a huge impact. But it also creates an opportunity. And just as the federal government in the Kennedy era sort of set opening of a door, you might say, if we can fight back effectively what is happening at the federal sector, if the work that people like Eric and MT are doing to bring people together and to make this a real resistance, that can also bleed out to local schools like Aurora's, to the private sector labor movement as well. And so this is a really momentous time. And really what happens here is going to help shape things for a long time.
And certainly there is a portion of the federal workforce that is directly involved in private sector labor struggles, such as the NLRB. And Todd, you mentioned the Federal Conciliation Mediation workers. You can feel free to chime in on that, but those actually directly interact with private sector unions. And when their capacity is cut, obviously everything suffers. But Todd, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, no, thanks for raising that. And I think this is so fascinating because I think it's such a great assemblage of folks on this in this webinar right now, because we have, and I as someone who studies the federal sector and watches it closely, I'm so excited to hear more about the Federal Unionist Network and all the organizing work, because traditionally unions we haven't seen a formal network crossing unions like this. So I think that's a major development. Excited to hear more. And then, on the agency kind of legal side, I can kind of just speak to that. One of in the deluge of news, which has felt like these past few weeks, folks on this webinar will be, if you haven't seen seen it, you may not have caught the latest about the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, which, as Michelle was saying, plays a key role in the private sector and in many states, public sector and federal sector by statute to mediate collective bargaining agreements and also grievance mediations and other cases. But on March 14th, President Trump issued an order that, let's see, I wrote it down somewhere here. Yeah, he ordered that it, along with 6 other agencies, eliminate non-statutory functions and components and reduce the performance of their statutory functions and associated personnel to the minimum presence and function required by law. The latest I've heard from inside FMCS is, and this is just still shocking to me, is an agency of over 200 people at the, January 1st of this year is now down to 4 commissioners of mediation for the entire United States. So 4 people actually mediating labor disputes, with about approximately 9 additional administrative staff. And I don't know if that's the current situation, but the rest of the agency has been put on administrative leave. This is nothing, new. This has happened, unfortunately, at other agencies, but this is the first kind of direct labor relations agency in the federal government that has kind of had this this type of order applied to it. And so to me, it's clearly unlawful when one looks at the statute, but as we've been seeing, this can take a long time to be litigated in the court. So I think what we're already talking about here is that kind of, we have that organizing side of it, but we also have the legal side, which I think is also really important. And just this past Friday, a group of states, 21 states, led by the state of Rhode Island, filed a lawsuit in the District of Rhode Island to try and save FMCS, along with the Institute for Library Museum Services, or Institute for Museum and Library Services, and the Minority Business Development Agency in the Department of Commerce. So it's like hot off the presses reading those complaints. It's hard. I know if people are trying to keep up, but I want to, especially for all the kind of ILR labor relations folks out there, it is worth kind of tracking down that complaint and really reading, because I think the states did a really good job of showing the importance of FMCS to the country's labor relations system and to all of these states. I think it was New Mexico that actually requires FMCS to mediate as part of its public sector. I think maybe schools, or I'm not sure, but, and it's like, what is it going to do, with 4 mediators for the entire country, public and private sector, they're not going to get the services. So, I mean, I don't have to tell people on this call who just like me are so enamored of the skills and resources available in the FMCS. This is just really shocking to see. But that being said, I'll pass the torch now, but happy to chat and answer questions too. I think if there is a silver lining, I think the legal cases are very strong that we're seeing, and in some senses, I think there's a lot of potential. But as this roller coaster that we're on, it changes every day. But I am been really impressed with the breadth and depth of the challenges on that front. So happy to talk more and happy to hear about organizing too. So, thanks.
You're in a room full of labor nerds, so there will be
great. This is the place
looking for extra credit from you. Eric, I don't know if you wanted to. I mean, you wrote a book about teachers' strikes and sort of resistance happening from the public sector workforce. On that front, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the, even predating Trump, there had been attacks on teacher unions and as well as resistance to that. So anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, but maybe I'll try to tie some of those lessons to what we're seeing today. One of the things that I think is true in labor generally, but oftentimes particularly in the public sector, is that the jurisdictions through which unions are obliged to operate are set up for us to lose. Oftentimes, it's just the power often requires us to. The power necessary to win often requires breaking beyond the specific administrative silos through which we've been sort of preset. So to give an example, in the 2018 teachers strikes, the big illegal red state strikes, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, normally struggles take place district by district in K-12, because that's nominally who the bosses are, right? But it's a setup meant to fail because actually most of the funding is from the state, and so you're end up fighting one hand tied behind your back. And so they sort of rank and file broke all of the rules and just said, okay, we're going to organize statewide. We're going to have these crazy Facebook groups, and we're going to sort of force the statewide unions to fight back and push them into a strike. And it was that breaking down of divisions, both by geography and by union, frankly, because you had, like in West Virginia, there's the AFT, there's NEA, and they didn't work together. And so the rank and file led, and were able to forge a new unity based on a more militant perspective, but then also, frankly, based on a more united perspective and a broader perspective. And so I think the Federal Unionist Network is doing something really similar, which is, the federal sector, I still am barely wrapping my head around it. It's so Byzantine. There's like so many different agencies and so many different unions, and they don't work with who, and this person doesn't like that person, and this person, it's like there's all of this stuff. And it turns out, though, as you might expect, that that's not conducive for meeting a moment of authoritarian takeover. And what is conducive for meeting a moment of authoritarian takeover is workers working together as workers across their divisions, across the union divisions, across agencies. And that's really where the power is. So to me, that is like a broader lesson that, even if it means getting, workers who aren't in the same union. And that is really anathema, frankly, to a lot of the labor movement, which, so much of the labor movement is at this point still, really, to me, the thing I find most, I don't know if the most, one of the things I find most enervating is that there's an authoritarian takeover, and so many unions are still like not actually even fighting in conjunction with other unions, let alone like fighting in the way I would want them to. But even as a minimum, if you're going to like do small days of action, you might as well do it with other unions, not just like every union separately. And so I think that the fund is really trying to push forward a different vision, and MT can talk about it more, where it's like, no, we're all federal workers. We should be fighting back together. And we saw some inklings of that. The fund has been able to do some like big national mass calls where all of the federal unions were on board. I don't know if that's ever happened before. I don't know if you've ever gotten like all of the federal union leaders on one call publicly together. Maybe. I'm not that I'm aware of. And then, a lot of the unions sort of under pressure, came on board somewhat last minute for April 5th. Which is good, but frankly, like it would have been good if they'd been building it for a month and like really driven turnout. And so I think that going forward, just flagging this question of unity is really important, and hopefully that there can be united mobilizations around May 1st, but then also just around the campaigns. Think about Social Security. Like Social Security, this impacts every union. To me, this is like, if we think about the power analysis, like where the weak point is for the Musk-Trump agenda, Social Security, they're so stupid for attacking Social Security. Everybody loves Social Security. And so this is the type of thing that not only has very broad public support, but impacts every union, because every union has a retirees group that is literally about to get, totally blown over by these cuts. And so every union has a stake in it right now. So every union should be organizing like a Save Social Security campaign. And that is sort of starting to happen. But I think that the fund has a campaign that's about to launch in late April around saving Social Security, together with also saving the VA and the EPA. And I hope that this would be something that any labor people out there can look to, be like, yeah, Social Security, like let's all join in on these days of action on getting our members to be fighting back. Every union has a stake in this. And I'll do one pitch for the fund. If you're not already supporting, even if you're not a federal worker, you should go to savepublicservices.com, because it's really going to be the public support and the support of other unions that it's going to, I think, take the federal workers over the finish line. Because this is one difference maybe from the teachers. I'll leave it at this. Teachers had a lot of strike leverage. If teachers go on strike, you can force politicians to listen to you because of the social crisis. I don't think federal workers have that leverage right now, frankly, because I don't think Musk would be happy for workers to go on strike and use that as an excuse to fire them. And I think federal workers know that. So the public support is going to be even more important in that context as far as leverage.
As you mentioned, one thing that might help build a united front is the fact that this assault is so massive and is affecting so many different types of workers who had previously been siloed from each other. a recent executive order actually aims to strip nearly 1 million federal workers of collective bargaining rights. There had been also an earlier executive order that carved a whole swath of the federal workforce out of civil service labor protections, which had provided protections like just cause. So in terms of the actual attacks on collective bargaining that we're seeing unfold right now, as well as just cause, due process, et cetera, how do you think having that on the horizon is perhaps lighting a fire under some of the unions and labor groups that are sort of at the front lines of this? Or how do you see the response to that playing out, possibly or negatively? Anyone can take that. But I mean, Joe, I think you've studied how sort of historically public sector federal protections for collective bargaining have come under assault. Maybe you want to chime in on that.
Sure. Sure. And maybe I'll build off of what Eric was saying. I think Eric made some wonderful points there about the importance of the network of fun, but also about its orientation towards saving public services. And I think the problem that federal workers have right now is that what is happening to them, the stripping of union rights, basically making federal employees into at-will workers, which has been happening with the way that these cuts have occurred. And those two things basically are pushing federal workers on the same plane as most other workers in the country who lack job security and union rights. And so the problem of rallying the public around a real injustice and an attack on union rights is that so many workers are already in that boat. And so there are two things that are true here. We have to stop this because you can't undermine federal workers' union rights without undermining everybody's union rights. And truly, it is the case today, as it's always been, that an injury to one is an injury to all for labor. And that happens if you're going to strip bargaining rights. But the way to fight back against that isn't necessarily to put that front and center so much as to build public support around the preservation of the services that federal workers do. And so the challenge now, I think, is how do we wed those things? I think one of the things that we've seen over the past 10 years, which has really, prepared us in a way for this fight, is the emergence of a phenomenon like bargaining for the common good, where unions learn to, align parents groups and the community with the union in its fights. This happened organically in West Virginia and in some of the other, Red for Ed locations that Eric wrote about in his book, where in West Virginia, the teachers went out not just for a raise for themselves, but for all state workers. So by framing the fight in that kind of broad way, they were able to, advance things and accomplish something that, nobody could have seen beforehand. So, the threat right now is if this happens to federal workers, it's not going to stop there. And there's an opportunity in turning it back. But the way we do it, I think, matters a whole lot. And as Eric pointed out, I think FUN has found the right approach to doing this.
Yeah, maybe MT and Aurora both want to bounce off of what Joe was saying. You are both involved in public sector unions yourselves. MT has been doing work with FUN. How do you sort of make the case for collective bargaining, for these sort of public sector worker protections through, I guess, the lens of what we might call the sort of consumer side of these public services, right? Or how do you sort of make the case to the broader public about the value of the services you're providing, but also about the principle of protecting the people who provide those services? So either MT or if you want to chime in, that'd be great.
Happy to start. Sorry. Yeah, so I think what Joe was just talking about, bargaining for the common good, is like exactly how we try and frame things. So our kind of catchphrase this bargaining season has been that teacher working conditions are student learning conditions, and just really tying those together. You know, like, yes, we're fighting for higher wages. That is one of our big things, but that is because we're facing a teacher retention crisis in our district where we cannot keep teachers. And it's not that they're leaving the profession, although many people do leave the profession. They're going to teach in neighboring districts where they can get paid more. So that, like, trying to help our community see that when that happens, our students have less stability, they have less experienced teachers, and that hurts their own learning. Also fighting for things like smaller class sizes, smaller caseloads for our related service providers, librarians in every building, mental health supports for students, like all of these things that are about our work and about our students' learning conditions. And I mean, like, just basic things about having like enough workspaces so that our social workers are not providing counseling services under stairwells, which is like how things are happening now, or in hallways, right? So these are all things that we're trying to tie our needs to what our community wants as, yeah, beneficiaries of this public service. And I think that, you know, the bargaining for the common good is so valuable for, like, it's useful for our members as well, because most people that go into public service, in my experience, are people who are, I mean, teachers are not becoming teachers for the clout, right? They become teachers because they really care about the kids, right? And like, I think a lot of teachers are scared to seem like they're selfish or they're greedy. And it's like, no, I'll just do more for the kids. And I think it's really important that we, as workers, resist that and say, like, no, supporting ourselves, supporting our families is what our students need as well, right? And we are fighting for our whole community when we fight for ourselves. And I think doing that, at the school district level right now is like how we're kind of, I think through open negotiations and open bargaining, we have like built so much power in our union. We have so many new leaders emerging. Eric was talking about training leaders before. Like we have like opened this door, and there's all these new people engaged in union work who have never engaged before, who are bringing their families in and who are bringing their friends in. And I think that this like building power from below, like, to me, is how we rebuild the working class and like create a fighting working class. So I think that it's like, of course, right now the attacks on federal workers are like, it's not impacting us directly, but like we still need to be organizing in some, I think like organizing at any level right now is like practice and preparation for when the attacks will impact us directly.
Yeah, and I think similarly, so with the Federal Unionist Network, we're focusing on this campaign of save our services, right? Our work, our jobs are providing public services. We're serving the public. And so when you take our jobs, you take away those services. So that's really how we're trying to frame it. And so, and people understand that. People understand that they have clean water, they have food that's been tested and is safe to eat because federal workers are providing those services. It's a very like clear message, right? They get their Social Security check because a federal worker cut it. And so that's right now the Federal Unionist Network big campaign and big messaging around that. I think that to the executive order that stripped away collective bargaining rights for almost 1 million federal workers, I think that, you know, we know that they can take away our right to have a collective bargaining agreement. They can take away our right to grieve unfair labor practices, but they can't take away our right to organize, right? The task is still the same. It's still workers getting together and fighting the issues that matter the most to them and improving their material conditions. So, you know, in some ways, like, we still have to do the same thing. This is obviously like a massive assault on the labor movement entirely if they succeed at the federal level. But our response, it needs to be workers coming together, building each other up, building solidarity, supporting each other, and taking action to win. And so I think that, that's really the response here. And that's what the Federal Unionist Network is doing. We've organized multiple days of actions. We've had federal workers who, like myself, who have never organized a rally before. We're not really known for speaking out over here. We really love rules. So, but now federal workers are stepping up. Like, when the Federal Unionist Network has had a mass call, thousands of people, and including many hundreds of federal workers, say, I want to organize, right? I want to do something about this. And so that's why we're able to, have national days of actions and then forming like regional organizing committees where federal workers across agencies, across unions can come together and say, what's next? How can we build a local coalition? How can we push and improve our conditions here? And find local allies to ultimately pressure at a federal level and continue to fight the administration.
Is Eric still here? Oh yeah, Eric, before you go, is there anything you want to shout out? You and MT are both involved with FUN. Anything coming up that people should know about? And I'll anyone who wants to get in touch with Eric afterwards, I can put you in touch with them.
Yeah, sorry, I have to go pick up my kid from school. So I mean, I'll just say a general point, which is that I think, so I really agree with Joe as far as the stakes. It's like the stakes of this would be hard to exaggerate for just like the future of American democracy and the labor movement and the whole working class. So I hope that for people who aren't yet fully back in organizing mode, that you will get into organizing mode immediately, because the major obstacle I think so far, maybe this is different after last Saturday, has just been so many people are in like doom and gloom, or it's just like everything is so awful in the world, and I just want to like politically hibernate for 4 years. And that is, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if people don't organize, then Trump can get away with it. But I honestly just think we will win. I think we can win, and I think it's like Trump has done a massive overreach. They've combined that with all the crazy terror stuff right now, which is undercutting its own base. And so it's just like there's a real possibility, not in like 2 years, but in like within the next 2 months, of starting to scale up like a really widespread, even more than we saw this last weekend, resistance movement that isn't just these days of action, although those are like an example of the movement, but where people are organizing their coworkers, and it can be sort of escalating disruptive actions with the community. But that's going to require like every single person, especially on this type of call, to be actively involved. And so I think that if you're not already involved in your union, please do. If you haven't already organized your workplace, organize your workplace. Sign up on savepublicservices.com. But now is really the moment. Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it with that. It is going to really require every single one of us stepping up and going all in. And I think if we do, we have a real chance of winning, because what they're doing is extremely unpopular. I think our side is finally has a little bit more momentum in our, behind our backs right now. So it's time to go all in. And I hope to see you all in the streets and organizing meetings. Oh yeah, and somebody said, "Where's the AFL-CIO?" I will say this: one last thing. They've been doing okay. So the AFL-CIO has been supporting it. So and I think MT can confirm it's AFL, some of the good folks at the AFL. But on the whole, frankly, the labor movement is like still sleeping. It's like you're just trying to take away collective bargaining rights for 1 million workers, and like the most you're asking people to do in most places is call members of Congress. It's like, come on, like that is like far short of what is necessary given the scale of the attacks. So it's like they're doing some stuff, good for them, but they could be doing and should be doing a lot more.
Yep. Thanks, Eric. And I guess to wrap up, maybe I'll combine the last two questions and then we can jump into the Q&A. I think some of the politics around public sector workers has been an effort on the part of the right to sort of paint civil servants as, I don't know, lazy bureaucrats, as people who are overpaid, as people who are sort of constantly sort of interfering with people's freedoms, just painting the federal government and, maybe state and municipal governments as well as people who sort of cause problems rather than solve them. But we've also been seeing sort of a groundswell of mobilization and advocacy coming from these same agencies. So I guess to folks like MT, and of course, others who have been observing this fight, what what do you think about that perception of public sector workers, and where is sort of the resistance now in terms of not only making people aware of what's at stake, but also trying to sort of challenge some of those stereotypes and push back against that narrative that is often painted by the right?
Sure. So yeah, I think that this is a really big issue for us right now, and it has been, right? It's been growing, and I don't think that there was really any concerted effort to stop, to oppose this narrative of federal workers as lazy, as inefficient, and unfortunately, that has, by kind of like allowing that to grow, this has taken us to where we are, and now is when we need to be fighting it. And I think that we are seeing it change. I think, on April 5th, there's so many signs that say, so many people standing up saying, hands off Social Security, hands off the VA, hands off Medicaid, right? And I think that's recognizing that these services and those workers are really important and are necessary for the functioning of our society, for our democracy. And so I definitely think the narrative is changing and it's shifting, but I think that it really, unfortunately, like speaks to like kind of the quietness of the federal unions and the labor movement, and kind of failing to address this, failing to, have a media presence, failing to have a counter narrative. And now that we're at this crisis moment, we absolutely need this. And I think, yeah, we're seeing some shifts, but I think it's really hard. And I mean, I'll just say that when we were, our return to office, we were told, in terms of cleaning supplies, we have one Clorox box and don't take more than one wipe, to keep your office clean. So like, I will say, we're really like, it's very slimmed down over here. But just to put that out there.
Aurora, I think you've probably been dealing, I mean, maybe not in Ithaca, I don't know, but in general, teachers have been some of the first workers, public sector workers, to come under attack, weirdly. But do you have insights as to how teachers and other similarly positioned civil servants can frame their narrative in a way that sort of pushes back against the story that the right has been telling?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that the effort to like privatize our public schools through the charter school reform movement is like kind of was at the forefront of this, like depicting teachers as lazy, as, greedy, as, stagnant because we have tenure, so we're protected, so we can't get fired, so we all stink, so public education is destroyed, going back to like a nation at risk. And through to, I mean, like whether it was George W. Bush or Obama, like both were very on the charter school bus. And I mean, Cory Booker famously privatized many of the schools in Newark. I'm from New Jersey, so I'm from Maplewood, New Jersey. And so, yes, I was there. I remember that back in the day. But I do think that, I think that what turned the tide more than anything else was teacher organizing and teacher bargaining for the common good. And I think that the Chicago teachers in 2012 with their massive strike, I mean, I was in high school at the time, and that was like the most inspiring thing I'd ever seen. And I wanted to become a teacher, and I wanted to become a labor organizer because of it. It was like these teachers who were like, the idea that it is teachers' faults that our students don't have enough to eat and don't have like a place to live and are therefore doing badly on standardized tests that were, written by eugenicists like 100 years ago, right? It's like, it's ridiculous. But it was a really powerful narrative that Democrats and Republicans agreed on. I mean, Rahm Emanuel was the mayor of Chicago, and then he was, one of Obama's top people, right? So, and he was the one trying to break this strike and trying to destroy the Chicago Teachers Union. So the Chicago teachers coming out and basically doing that like deep organizing and talking to caregivers, resisting school closures, they were able to like win the city over and demonstrate that like we are the people who care for your kids. Like we support this community. We love your children. We are doing our best for them without any resources that we need. And this is what we need, right? And they went on strike and the city stood with them. And I think that that was like a huge sea change. And I think that, you know, in reading Eric's first book, Red State Revolt, like that is clearly a message, is that these teachers in West Virginia and elsewhere were inspired by Chicago teachers. So I think it's like we have to organize where we are. We have to organize in our communities. We have to be very clear about the services we provide and why they matter and how much we care. And I think that, like, you know, a lot of people might be like, oh, teachers are greedy, but my kid's teacher is great. You know, like I think that it's like, yeah, obviously I'm against government spending, but don't take my social security check, right? So it's like we have to find what are those places that people recognize actually this is a good thing, and like use that as our opening to organize them and to help them see that like we're all in this together. And yeah, kids need to go to school, and wouldn't you rather that they go to school in a place that, you know, is well supported and has professionals who know what they're teaching?
Yep. Joe, I know you just you recently wrote about what you hope to see from federal sector labor unions. Todd has actually been in a federal workers union. Do either of you have insights on you know, where how this narrative can sort of be reclaimed or reshaped by the workers themselves?
Why don't you go first, Todd?
Thanks, Joe. You know, I loved thank you, Aurora and MT. And I think too, the kind of half glasses half full these past few weeks for me is like every time I hear on the drive with NPR, it's a, you know, a federal park ranger giving an interview about her working experience in Montana, or a CDC public health communicator. I do think that we've had this opportunity to have the American public exposed to the day-to-day work of federal workers in a way that I've never seen before. And again, that doesn't necessarily translate immediately into organizing wins, but at the same time, I haven't actually seen a groundswell of anti-federal worker. It's, you know, so I think actually it's just, I think that that's what we were talking about earlier, is how do you move forward? But I actually think hearing some of the congressional town halls about services being cut in states across the country, constituents are not happy when the VA can't see their neighbors or their family members, right? And so I think, you know, the narrative is actually on the side of federal workers. It's just this continual need for education, that because of so much is happening, that's where I think people just get overwhelmed. And as Eric was saying, they can flip off or go into doom scroll mode. So I think that's really going to be the key thing, is just education, 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 and making that personal connection. But I just am so inspired. Every federal worker who has had this job insecurity, as MT was talking about, but still, you know, jumping on the evening news to share her story is just truly inspiring. And I think the American people see that as well.
Well said, Todd. I would pick up on that, first circling back to what was Aurora was saying in response to Michelle's earlier question about the long pedigree of, you know, this idea that public servants are somehow parasites. And it is a very long running pedigree. You can hear stuff like this back in the New Deal era. In recent years, it's hard to disentangle a lot of that, though, I think, from the racism, which is behind a lot of this. Aurora talked about being inspired by Karen Lewis, you know, how she was depicted by union enemies in 2012 was really grotesquely racist and sexist. And Daniel Ho Sang and Joseph Lowndes have kind of written about public workers as the new welfare queens, because that's how they were being portrayed in recent years. And so that's why I say this has been a kind of a long time coming, a kind of building public animus against, you know, public sector workers. And a lot of it was stoked in the era of Scott Walker and what he did. And, you know, of course, he wasn't alone, Mitch Daniels in Indiana and so many others, right? what do I hope will come out of this moment? Well, I think, those, um, you know, destructive tropes thrived because people weren't really focused on and didn't see public sector workers. Um, as Aurora said, people liked their teachers, but they would say they hate a teachers union. They would blame a teachers union for what's wrong in the schools. What I think is happening now, what has an opportunity to happen, is that the scale of the problem that we are now facing is such that it breaks down the old silos. That's why the fund has to be a network that crosses all agencies, that crosses unions. That's the scale of the problem. That as the old structures become unable to, work in this scale of threat, I think we're pulled out into the open and with each other in a way that we can see each other more clearly, I think, and push back against those dangerous, long-lasting tropes and really build a kind of solidarity that we haven't had. I mean, as terrible as this moment is, and I don't want to in any way, overemphasize the silver lining part because it is really a dangerous moment. But I do think that there is an opportunity in it. Let's face it, where you work, MT, the NLRB has been severely underfunded for years. It can't really do its work, and yet it was doing its work, extraordinarily well, especially in the Biden years. In Ithaca public schools or in any of the public schools of this country, they're not funded in the way they ought to be. And that was one of the things the Chicago teachers did right away, is they went after the fact that the way the schools were being, administered financially was slowly suffocating them. So one opportunity in this moment is that we don't have to defend a status quo which wasn't working. That status quo has been ripped away from us. Now we're in an all-out fight. I heard somebody today describe it as a knife fight in a phone booth, and it's sort of like that. It's a tough fight. It's a fight that, really has to bring us out of ourselves, and we don't have to be caught in the defense of, the old structures because they are falling. Now, the challenge for us is how we build something together in this new environment. And, it's sink or swim. We either build it or we all suffer the consequences. And what I'm so encouraged by in this panel and from what I've been seeing is that so many people are stepping up toward, let's build it.
Just speaking of attacks on public sector workers and sort of the racial and gender bias element, I think it's also important to keep in mind that this attack on federal and public sector workers has taken place in tandem with this sort of like anti-woke, anti-DEI sort of ideological thrust. And so the sort of inherent racism and sort of the equivalency that's drawn between sort of like a white supremacist system and so-called meritocracy and pitting the public sector workforce against that should definitely be top of mind when we're talking about organizing. So I'm going to go to a couple of the questions from the Q&A. Randy wrote, what are unions doing or strategizing to persuade other unions who back Trump to shift their support to Democrats to directly impact the midterm elections and thereby preserve jobs through legislation? So I guess the broader question is, how does all this play out politically in terms of how unions position themselves?
Can I just jump in on the first, and I'm excited to hear others on this bit, because one of the things that was really, I think, fascinating to note, and there's so much to keep up on, I haven't checked in on it, but one of the, in a last bullet point on President Trump's fact sheet on the executive order that we've been discussing, where he says the White House says President Trump supports constructive partnerships with unions who work with him. He will not tolerate mass obstruction that jeopardizes his ability to manage agencies. It's interesting to look at what agencies were not exempted from the executive order. So, for example, the Border Patrol is actually not included in the order that just came out. So while VA nurses have been exempted from collective bargaining, the Border Patrol still has collective bargaining. So the National Border Patrol Council is still covered. So it'll be really interesting to see, how does the National Border Patrol Council work with its union brothers and sisters, and it's part of AFGE, the largest federal union. And others in the webinar may be more up to speed on it, but I think it's a real opportunity for engagement and solidarity across. And to me, it's also prime evidence of President Trump. It's not national security as his focus. It's what he calls constructive partnerships with unions that work with him. And I think that matters for the legal context. But so that's not answering the question, but I just wanted to frame that for context, because we are going to have some unions have a real opportunity to kind of see where they stand.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that real quick and say that another union that was exempted in the collective bargaining order that Trump put out was the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. And to me, that's very telling. If anybody remembers the 2019 shutdown, it came to an abrupt end when, a group of controllers called in sick on the final morning of that shutdown. By noon, the administration was ready to end it. And that showed that, they were so strategically placed and that they could bring about something like that without ever having to really strike. There are people in the federal service who, could do things short of a strike that could really help their brothers and sisters. This is a moment to really test the issue of solidarity, as was the Patco strike, right? One of the reasons why it was so devastating was that the labor movement couldn't do any more than organize some rallies and marches, but no real collective action resistance. If we don't marshal some kind of resistance in this fight, I think we're really going to suffer. And so, it remains to be seen whether the movement can stand up and stand together. As Eric said, there's been movement in the right direction, but not at the scale that, meets the threat as it currently exists.
MT or Aurora, I'm not sure if you can make a political electoral pitch directly, but I know the teachers union is also very involved in local politics, so maybe you have some insights on sort of how the politics play out on the community level. And MT and NLRBU is probably not the strongest lobbying force in Washington, but certainly I know people in your workplace are probably thinking about these things. So either of you?
I'll just say briefly that I think that our focus right now needs to be organizing labor right now and not being focused on electoral 2 years from now. I think that if we organize right now and we manage to push back on a lot of these things and succeed, then I think electoral victories will follow, and hopefully electoral victories that are not just a Democrat, but like someone who actually is willing to fight, right? Like that's what we need, are people who are willing to fight. And I think that organize first and then elect people who are willing to fight and kind of capitalize on the wins that we've already gained, as opposed to like putting all of our hopes in a 2-year. I'm just thinking about what Eric said, like maybe we could win in the next 2 months. And I was like, really? So maybe we can. And that's what we should. I don't think it's not just a 2-year horizon. So I think right now we organize as workers in our workplaces and with other workers in solidarity, and trust that that's what I'll say.
Yeah. Who knows where we'll be in 2 years, for God's sakes, at this point. But MT, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think these executive orders and what Trump is doing is also like a classic union busting tactic of trying to separate workers from themselves. So for example, like last week we saw, I think maybe about 4 of 8 Department of Health and Human Services offices closed, and those were mostly closed in primarily blue states or blue regions. So again, like separating federal workers, separating us from ourselves, is one is this tactic that we're seeing, and then similarly with the executive order, removing collective bargaining rights from federal workers, except for some certain ones like border patrol or law enforcement, of which the National Labor Relations Board union, we enforce the National Labor Relations Act, actually. So we still have that, but to what Aurora was saying, like it's about solidarity, right? So we can't let ourselves be divided. We need to be organizing together, and that's the question here: is like how do we do that right now, so that we're able to stand up together, and that's what we need to be working on.
And then politicians will be following your lead instead of the other way around, hopefully. So this is a slightly wonky question directed at the NLRB folk. Is it better? So is it better or worse for public sector unions that the NLRB's quorum is, well, I guess it should be private sector unions. Is it better or worse for unions that the NLRB's quorum is currently uncertain, meaning that NLRB is sort of hamstrung at this point? What does that, I mean, NLRB is not just what the National Labor Relations Board in Washington rules on, but what do you think about sort of the impasse that your agency is currently under?
Yeah, so I think, well, actually today we got board member Wilcox reinstated. So we're back to having quorum, who knows for how long. But I think that in terms of like how it works for the private sector, if you file a unfair labor practice charge, there's actually quite a lot that happens before it even gets to the board. So an investigator like myself would investigate it. There'd be a decision, there'd be maybe a chance to settle it, and then if not, could go before an administrative law judge. So, actually there's still quite a lot of opportunities for justice to occur, for people to have their rights vindicated under the National Labor Relations Act. Again, kind of regardless of whether or not there's a quorum, there's still a lot of work to be done. However, I think to what Joe has mentioned, the National Labor Relations Board has been underfunded, understaffed, and so this impacts case processing times. This impacts our ability to get the agency's ability to enforce the act, to enforce the rights that workers have under the act. And this act was passed in the 30s, so it's a quite old act, and was only updated once in the 40s, the Taft-Hartley Act. So I think also the way we think about it, it's none of this is. I think that a lot of things haven't changed to meet the modern era, and so I think that there's, besides taking issues that workers have to the National Labor Relations Board, there's a lot of things they can do in their workplace too. Like we've been saying, organizing.
Joe, do you have any thoughts on, I mean, you don't have to go back all the nearly 100-year history of the NLRA, but talk about what the role of the NLRB is and why people should care at this point.
Oh, it's a crucial agency, and as MT pointed out, it's been there so long now. It'll celebrate its 90th anniversary, the Act, on July 5th. And, it's a real question now about whether it will live much beyond that because of what's happening. And I would just say this about the Act, that the Wagner Act and what it set in motion probably did more to make this a multiracial democracy in a real sense than anything that followed. Even preparing the way, I think, for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, because of the organization of workers, because of the democratization that happened in the workplace. And so, I think it's really important for us to think about what's going on now as not just a fight of unions for their future, not just a fight about worker rights, but it's really a fight about the future of democracy. Because the institutions that we're rallying around to defend now, the unions that we're trying to, build in this moment, they are the ultimate guardians of the democracy. We can't, and we've seen, we can't rely on the courts to do it. We can't rely on the politicians, and I agree entirely with Aurora. Let's not focus now on, how to elect a Democrat, but let's focus on how to build power so that we can elect a Democrat who will actually stand with labor. Um, and so, it's a momentous moment, right? But think about it this way. An institution like the NLRB lasting 90 years, that's a kind of a remarkable thing. Um, and as MT said, renovated really only once, and in a way that weakened it. I think we also need to think about this moment providing opportunities to revisit these basic questions and to think about what we need in the 21st century that can help us make that century a century of democracy, this century in the way, the board helped to democratize the country in the 20th century.
And I think this is a good question to end on. Rakshith asks, I'm a current high school student, incoming college freshman, thinking about entering a role in public service, especially towards labor and small business support. Are there any ways young people, especially high school and college-age students, can be involved meaningfully in organizing efforts even before we join the workforce? So anyone, feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start just to say yay. That's awesome. We love that. And there's so many ways that you can do public service, and I recommend becoming a teacher personally. But I think how you can support right now, I mean, YDSA is a youth, the Young Democratic Socialists of America, they stand for, and they, I know locally, but also across the country, they do a lot of really great labor solidarity work. And Eric mentioned EWOC, which is the Emergency Workplace Organizing Collective or some C. EWOC is a really amazing project that's a collab with UE, the United Electric Workers, and DSA that helps connect workers who are needing organizing to organizers. So you can volunteer with EWOC, and I think a lot of YDSA chapters have ways of doing that. You can volunteer with EWOC and then you like get paired with a union or with a worker who's trying to organize a union. So that's just like a broad way of getting involved in general in terms of like meeting the moment. I think, again, connecting with whether it's YDSA or another local organization or national organization. I think signing up for the thing that Eric put in the chat and you'll hear more. But I think everyone should be joining organizations now. Like, I think we need to be connected. We can't just be individuals signing, like going to a rally. That's great. But like in terms of organizing, we have to be connected and we have to be working together. So if you don't have a workplace to organize, then joining another organization. That's my advice.
This is making me think of, one of the innovations that we've seen in the federal sector unions is have like I think AFG calls it the Young Network, young organizers, but it's like something for public sector unions to think about as future members, right? So like, there's no reason why that network can't be extended to the high schools, right, for that engagement. And I think it would be inspiring because I think part of the struggle here is, the administration, it seems like it wants to make public service not kind of something that one looks up to do. And I think that's what's so critical, is that people don't lose that passion for public service. And that was just a brainstorm I had listening to you, Aurora and Joe, about like, hey, maybe that's the next generation for these young networks, prior to even entering the workforce, getting engaged and getting active. So very, very inspired here.
Gotta get them while they're young. Joe or MT? Okay. Sure. That's a good note to end on then. So I put some websites in some website URLs in the chat, especially for our young guests. They can go to learn more about YDSA, about the emergency, the EWOC, which is at workerorganizing.org. And this is also, this is part of Union Days, which I believe is part of the broader Labor Spring kind of nationwide series of programs and events. events that are aimed at young people, particularly college students, trying to sort of raise consciousness and get people involved in the labor movement. So hopefully the next generation will, we can pass the torch on to a generation that is hopefully better prepared to deal with such things than we are currently. But I think we'll end it here. Thank you all so much for your questions and for being a part of this conversation. Thank you to our panelists. A recording of this event hopefully will be up on the ILR website or YouTube. And if anyone wants to get in touch with the panelists to ask about, a workplace labor rights question or to help build some of the activist networks that they're part of, just get in touch with me. And thank you again to everyone for this, and good luck.
Yeah.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.